So I was scrolling through YouTube and I stumbled upon a video titled Abortion and Personhood, what the moral dilemma is really about. If you want to watch this video for yourself, I'm going to link it down below in the description, or you can look it up and watch it through Big Think on YouTube. But essentially, we're just going to watch this video, or at least clips of this video, to where I'm going to pause it and then add my own commentary periodically, so we can digest some of the rationality and logic that this video is trying to put forward, and we'll be determining whether or not this is good rationality, good morals, good ethics, or not. So I'm very excited, so let's just dive right into it. Okay, I'm getting excited.
In the 1970s, we had the Roe v. Wade decision in the United States. It was a decision relating to a woman's right to have an abortion. It introduced the trimester framework. It basically allowed first trimester abortions, made it very difficult to have third trimester abortions. Essentially this was really met very quickly thereafter with a sort of backlash. And really the last 40, 50 years of American history have more or less been a backlash against Roe v. Wade and an attempt to kind of criminalize abortion in all sorts of interesting ways without overturning the decision facially. So that's...
Okay, well, first I just want to say that he is approaching this more from a law standpoint, or a lawyer's view of this overall dilemma. He is a Harvard professor, and if he's going to come from a point of legality, we're going to have some problems, because for me, I'm going to be arguing from the point of morality, because morality is more fundamental than legality, considering that laws try to legislate or determine right and wrong conduct, but it doesn't actually dictate what is right and wrong. For instance, slavery used to be legal, but we would all say that slavery is wrong and that those laws were wrong because they inadequately tried to legislate morality. So if he's going to be coming from a legal perspective, this is going to be somewhat problematic, but let's continue.
It's kind of the legal playing field, and we can talk about some of the specifics, but the more interesting question, I think, is thinking about the morality of abortion. And I'll say that I think abortion is an extremely difficult question. So
good, we're going to be talking about the morality, so we're completely on the same page there. And then he says that abortion is difficult or complex. And then I would ask him, what do you mean by difficult or complex? Are you saying that it's going to be emotionally convoluted and that it's difficult emotionally, or are you saying that it's difficult on a moral basis, which is what I think he's leaning toward? But on a moral basis, this is actually a pretty straightforward diagnosis on the morality of abortion. However, I'm going to let him make his points before I start to respond more.
One of the first questions people have to think about is, are fetuses persons? Now that's a very important linguistic question, persons. I didn't say human beings, I didn't say alive. Those are three different issues, right? Something can be alive but not be a person. Your dog is a good example. You might love your dog, it's a wonderful thing, but it's not a person. Something can be human and potentially not be a person, right? Some people think the early embryo, for example, before 14 days, or stem cells being derived, are members of the human species, but may not be persons. So what do we mean by persons?
Interesting. Okay. So he highlighted three things, and I'm going to agree with him on this, to where he says there are three major highlights. You can argue for their personhood, the fact that they're alive, or if they're human, and he is trying to frame the question as if the morality of abortion hinges upon the fetus's or zygote's personhood. And I think this is a very interesting approach. I understand what he's doing. He's setting up and he's framing the question very well, except right off the bat, I'm going to disagree with him, and here's why. I would simply ask this question. Does somebody have living rights, personhood rights, or human rights? If the answer is human rights, then the other two are essentially nebulous in this overall dialogue, and here's why. For instance, you have to be human to have human rights. Human rights don't have anything necessarily to do with your personhood or necessarily the fact that you're alive. And I'll give you an example. We would still have to morally treat animals correctly, yet they are not persons by his own definition. I know some people would have a problem with that, and this really depends on how you define person, but I'm just using his own linguistics here. He said that a dog would not be considered a person. However, I would say that even though the dog isn't a person, we would still have to treat the dog with some sort of value, and that would destroy the personhood argument that you don't necessarily necessarily need to be a person to have value. Next, let's talk about being alive. For instance, a dead body is not alive, yet because of the genetics of the dead body being a human, there are certain things you can't do to dead bodies. You can't harvest their organs without permission, you can't deface their tombs, you can't dig them up, you can't steal from them, and you can't do a lot of other absolutely gross things to a dead body. Why? Because they are human and they still have human rights despite them not being alive. And that's why I find it more convincing to argue from a human perspective. It's also less complicated. For instance, we can determine whether or not somebody's a human genetically through genetic tests, through their DNA and chromosomes. To determine whether or not somebody is alive or a person is more difficult overall. However, this would only benefit his position by arguing for personhood because it's more metaphysical rather than genetic. That's why he's approaching this from a personhood standpoint. But again, to link it back to my original question, do we have person rights or human rights? We don't have personhood rights or person rights. We have human rights, which are based on our genetics. You do not need to be a person to have value, and you also don't need to be alive to have value. And that's why ultimately I think the structure in which he is about to build his argument ultimately collapses. But let's see what he can do.
We mean something that has a certain set of moral and or legal rights, the most important of which is a right against inviolability. They can't be killed or destroyed or harmed without very good reason. And we have the attitude that we're all persons, right? So we have an index case, we're pretty clear we're persons. And the question is, who else is a person? Well, to answer that, you need to have a theory about what makes something a person. And there are a few different kinds of theories you can have. One could be just to say, if X is living and a human being, X is a person. Right?
Do you see how he still needs the human aspect of this, meaning that being human is actually more fundamental than being a person? Therefore, the value, or rather the greater value, is found in the humanity, not necessarily the personhood. So again, he's building his arguments on straws here.
Right. Now, some people have problems with that. So Peter Singer and some animal rights advocates, for example, think that that's a speciesist attitude, that by saying human equals person, it's problematic that we're excluding animals. Instead, we ought to have some criteria that looks at capacity. So other people have sometimes what are called a capacity X view, where they say, in order to be a person, you have to have X capacity. And then we have to fill in what X is. Is it the ability to think complex thoughts, the ability to plan and look towards the future, the ability to feel pain, whether you understand it? Is it about continuity of an identity over time, or is it merely being alive and breathing? And some people think it's a single criteria, others think it's a compound criteria. And then there are complex questions about what happens for things that have the potential to have capacity X or had capacity X but lost it. So for example,
a lot of people normally bring up the latter. In the three examples that he brought up, normally people would agree with the latter. However, ultimately, all three collapse in on themselves because these types of definitions ultimately have various scenarios in which they do not work. However, let's see how he continues to try to build his argument.
A fetus doesn't have the ability, as early fetus, let's just say an embryo, just to make it very easy, an embryo before 14 days doesn't have the capacity to think deep thoughts about the future or have future orientation. I think that's pretty well accepted by everyone. But it certainly has the potential to do so, right? And the question is that enough? What kind of theory of potentiality? You know, hydrogen and oxygen each have the potential together to become water. But does that mean that they are water? They have the metaphysical properties of water? Or do we require more of a kind of potentiality? Something like, in the natural course of things, you will become something. The other difficult set of categories are things that once had the capacity but now no longer have it and perhaps never will again. So those that are brain dead, for example, are a good example. They are certainly human beings. Most cases they have been persons. But now if your capacity for personhood, how you define personhood, is something like the capacity to think deep thoughts about the future or to have future orientation, these are entities that no longer have that capacity and we don't believe will have it again. Do they see?
A capacity argument doesn't do much in terms of abortion. Why? Because like we said at the beginning, the reason why abortion would be wrong on a moral basis would be because they are a human being. and human beings have intrinsic value. A better argument for abortion would be to say that no one has intrinsic value and that human rights don't exist. That would be a far more logically consistent view for him to take. However, clearly that is going to be a less popular view, which is why he is still trying to hark on the personhood example. But since there's so many theories on how you establish or determine whether or not somebody has quote-unquote personhood, this is the trouble that he's running into.
Cease being persons at that point. This is to say that in order to understand whether a fetus or an early embryo, the kind that are used for stem cell derivation, is a person, you have to do a lot of metaphysical work at understanding what makes something a person and why, and what those capacities are. Now, even if you think something is a person, that doesn't necessarily mean you've solved the abortion problem. So it is possible, although popular among philosophers, not so popular in the political press, to say fetuses are persons, and yet abortion is still legal and justified. How does that argument go? The suggestion is that there is a right of another entity that has overcome whatever interest the fetus has.
Now, that is a very interesting scenario, and essentially it's saying that somebody else's right precedes or precludes their ability to step on or over somebody else's. And let me put it in the example of an unborn child and a mother. The mother is saying, well, my right to my body precedes the unborn's right to be born, which honestly doesn't make sense for two main reasons. One, the baby's body is distinct from the mother's body, even though the unborn used the mother's body. And two, the right to life is the most fundamental right, because without the right to life, you don't have any other rights, making it the most valuable according to this hierarchy. So to say that my right either to choose or to my body or some other right somehow allows me to infringe on your more fundamental right, which holds more value, doesn't make any sense. Because without life, I wouldn't have the right to my body, or my right to choose, or my right to not be pregnant, or something of that nature. And also I'd like to add, a lot of those rights are completely made up, and none of those rights are codified in the sense of you have the right to choose. Really? Choose what? Choose why? Says who? Written where? Or the right to your body. That doesn't make any sense either. Why? Because essentially all laws try to dictate and legislate what you can and can't do with your body, either to yourself or others. So unless you're trying to call every single law immoral, then you shouldn't make that argument. Anyway, let's go on and hear what he has to say.
That is the right typically of the mother who is gestating the fetus. So the claim is, yes, a fetus is a person. Yes, abortion will cause the death of a person, but that doesn't mean that abortion is wrong, because the woman gestating the fetus has a right to stop that gestating, even if it will result in the death of a person. And the most famous version of this argument comes from Judith Jarvis Thomson, a very famous thought experiment about the world's most famous violinist. And she says, imagine you find yourself, you had a heavy night of drinking, you got drunk, you blacked out, and you wake up the next morning and you find yourself a human dialysis machine hooked up to the world's most famous violinist. Nobody doubts the violinist is a person, right? He's not only a person, a great person, world's most famous violinist. But she says, don't you have the right to unplug yourself from that person?
For those of you who are not familiar with the violinist argument, honestly, in my opinion, it's one of the worst abortion arguments ever. There are far better abortion arguments besides the violinist argument, but essentially, it's a thought experiment to where you imagine you get kidnapped and then you wake up hooked up to a world-famous violinist, and by you being hooked up to him, you are going to be keeping him alive, and you just need to be hooked up to him for 6 months, and then beyond that point, he is going to survive. Do you have to be hooked up to him? And there are a plethora of responses to this. For instance, you're not related to the violinist, but let's make the argument even better and say somehow this violinist is related to you and it's your son. However, the first distinguishing factor that you would want to lay down is this would be unnatural care instead of natural care. This means you are artificially hooked up to somebody else, artificially keeping them alive, though they would die naturally. This is a completely separate case than a fetus or a zygote being naturally hooked up to the mother, to where the mother's body automatically and naturally and non-artificially takes care of and nurtures the unborn. So there's a huge moral distinction between natural care and unnatural artificial care. On top of that, the violinist is dying while the baby is not dying. The baby is growing and developing, so they are on completely different stages of life in that instance. One is becoming stronger, the other one weaker. One is developing, one is dying. And on top of that, here are other problems with the analogy. Pregnancy in and of itself doesn't involve kidnapping somebody. On top of that, pregnancy gives a natural connection from the host, while being hooked up artificially through wires and tubes is artificial, and thus a unnatural connection. Thirdly, saving the violinist would be nice, but not morally required, while on the other hand, a baby would be your moral obligation. Lastly, like we said earlier, a baby is taken care of automatically by the mother's body, while the violinist is not taken care of automatically, which requires extraordinary care rather than natural care, which is a very different moral dilemma in that instance. So these are just a couple of the ways that the violinist argument completely fails. The 4 reasons I previously gave, which highlighted the major moral differences, demonstrates that these scenarios are not morally analogous, and thus the comparison fails.
Even if it will turn out that it will result in the death of the violinist. And she says if you think the answer is yes, then you think that even though the entity is a person, you may have a right to cause its death, a right to unplug itself, and she analogizes that to the right of a mother to unplug.
Also, by unplugging the violinist, you are letting them die naturally, to where if you unplug yourself from a baby, you are killing the baby purposefully. Again, there is a different moral dilemma there. I can go into a lot of detail on this in another video, but as of right now, again, there are so many differences between these situations and circumstances that it just does not parallel well morally.
Plug herself from her fetus, who is a person. Now, there's lots of contestation about that thought experiment, right? You might say, you got drunk, no fault of your own, somebody kidnapped you. Is that really the situation of all women who become pregnant? Or is it the situation only of women, for example, who are raped or who are impregnated in an unconscious state? But this is just to show that there's some complexity here. Okay, one more point. That is that the stem cell question looks different on this regard. Remember, when we're talking about embryos, we're talking about embryos that are frozen, that are in a lab. Nobody is gestating them. If embryos have the rights of persons, unlike in the case of abortion, there's nobody who has a contrary right to stop gestating them. So you might actually think the argument for prohibition against destroying early embryos is easier than the argument for prohibiting abortion for this reason. Now, on the flip side, you might think the early embryos have even less of the capacity X, whatever that is, than does the fetus. But this is the way in which bioethicists and lawyers think about these problems.
Very interesting. The entire argument was built upon personhood, which, like we established in the beginning, is a very poor foundation for arguments because they are so metaphysical and there are so many different theories on how someone recognizes or establishes if they have personhood or not. This is why it is far stronger to build it based on the fact that you are a human being with intrinsic value, and this then gets reflected back into the biblical worldview of being created in the image of God and having the Imago Dei, and this goes very deep in that instance as well. However, even if you don't believe in that, a lot of my other friends from other different worldviews all say that the question about the morality that abortion hinges upon is not their personhood, but rather or not if they are a human being. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. This is just a video that I stumbled across. I might do more response videos like this, but we'll just see how it goes. And with that being said, I will see you in the next one.